Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Genetic Considerations in Having Children with Lauren Puryear. My name is Sarah Jo Ritchie. I am the volunteer coordinator at the Ehlers-Danlos Society, and I'm your moderator today. This webinar is part of our ongoing series, Living with EDS and HSD. So this is how today's webinar is going to work. Webinar attendees will be muted at all times during the webinar. However, you are able to type any questions you may have throughout the presentation into the question box at any time. Lauren will not be able to see or respond to any of these questions until the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Please do not send your questions more than once. It will not increase your chances of having your question answered, and it will only make it harder for us to sift through the questions and to make sure we can answer as many as possible. Lauren joins us again today, and she is a genetic, I can't read today. Thank you, brain fog. Let's try this again. Lauren Puryear joined the Genetic Medicine Clinic at the University of Washington Medical Center in 2016. She provides genetic counseling to patients referred to the clinic for a variety of conditions with a particular interest in vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and other connective tissue disorders. Ms. Puryear received a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Stanford University and worked as an educator and mediator before returning to school to study genetics. She received her Master of Science in Human Genetics and Genetic Counseling from Stanford University and was board certified by the American Board of Genetic Counseling in 2016. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be giving this talk again. This was a talk that I initially gave in Nashville for the EDS Society meeting about genetic considerations in having children. As my biography said, I'm a genetic counselor here at the University of Washington, and we see patients for a huge variety of genetic conditions. My particular interest is connective tissue disorders, including all the types of EDS and HSD, although we don't see very many people here in genetics for that because there really aren't genes yet, I will say. I'm sure there will be questions about that. So here's my plan for what I'm going to talk about, a quick little genetics refresher, and then a focus specifically on the genetics of different types of EDS. I'll talk through some very basic things about genetic testing, and then what the prenatal testing options are for a family that has a known genetic condition. And then I'll finish up with some considerations that genetic counselors talk with anyone who's thinking about having children. And so that is what we'll do. For terminology, I assume everybody who's in this audience knows what EDS and HSD stand for, but I like to put it in my slides anyway. When I talk about a genetic variant in this talk, what that means is a difference in a gene from the typical genetic sequence of that gene. So something that's not what we usually see in that gene. It may or may not cause a problem. We all have lots of genetic variants that are different from person to person. So if a genetic variant actually causes a disease, then we call it a pathogenic genetic variant. So when I talk about a pathogenic variant, that's what that means. The term mutation gets thrown around a lot. People sometimes use variant and mutation interchangeably, but technically a mutation is a new genetic variant. So one that's new in a person or new in a cell that wasn't in the previous cell that divided to create it. And once that variant is passed on from generation to generation, it's a variant, but it's no longer a mutation because it isn't new. So I will try to follow those technical guidelines as I'm using those terms. All right. So first of all, a little quick refresher on genetics. As you probably remember, we have many types of cells in our bodies, and almost all of them have their own complete set of genetic information. They're packaged up into chromosomes. We get half of our chromosomes from mom and half from dad. And each chromosome is just a long, tightly coiled up strand of DNA. You can see here where the DNA strand is stretched out, that it's made up of only 4 different types of genetic bases. Here they're kind of color-coded, red, green, yellow, and purple. But there are basically 4 building blocks that make up all of DNA. And when we look at a gene, we're just talking about a specific section of that DNA strand that codes for some information that the cell needs. So typically a gene makes a protein that the cell uses for something important. And what makes that gene different from other genes is the specific sequence of genetic building blocks. And so you can sort of read a gene and look at the sequence and see if it's typical or if there's some difference. So as I said, we get half our genetic information from mom and half from dad. So that means for all of the genes that we're talking about today that are associated with different types of EDS, you get one copy of that gene from mom and one copy of that gene from dad. And if mom or dad has any genetic variant in that gene, that gets passed along to any children that they have. So there are some different inheritance patterns for genetic conditions. And I'm going to focus mostly on the first three listed here because those are the ones that are relevant for all the types of EDS that we know about at this point. I'm not going to talk very much about the other types of inheritance. Autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive inheritance are the sort of common types of inheritance in genetic conditions. And autosomal just means not sex-linked. So they're not genes on the X or the Y chromosome that are sex chromosomes. And then I'll talk about de novo or brand new variants, mutations that are not necessarily inherited from either parent. So autosomal dominant inheritance is shown here in this diagram. This is a family tree with 2 parents and 4 kids. And you can see from the key that the people who have the genetic condition we're talking about are shaded in blue. So mom in this family has a genetic condition that can be passed on in an autosomal dominant pattern. And what that means is that mom and dad each have 2 copies of this gene that causes this condition. And dad has 2 normal copies. He doesn't have any genetic variants that are pathogenic that cause disease. Mom has a pathogenic variant on 1 copy of the gene, and that's enough to give her the condition. And so then you can see why this pattern makes sense of about 50% of the kids having the condition and 50% of the kids not having the condition, because mom gets to pass on either 1 copy or the other of this gene with each pregnancy. So the kids who get that pathogenic variant from mom are going to have the condition, and the kids who don't get it are not going to have that condition, and they won't be able to pass it on to their children. So the children here in this family who are shaded in white, who don't have the condition, they can't have kids with the condition either, unless there's a new mutation, which we'll talk about. So this is a family tree that shows an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. And you can see here the key is a little bit different. So the people who are affected with the condition are still shaded all the way in blue. But people who carry 1 genetic variant that's pathogenic are shown as carriers, where they're halfway shaded in. That doesn't mean they have half the condition. This is kind of a misleading diagram. Mom and dad, who are carriers in this family, would not be expected to have any features of this condition. They probably don't even know that they carry a pathogenic variant unless they've had some kind of carrier testing or screening. Pardon me. And you can see also that mom and dad don't have to have the same pathogenic variant. Sorry about that. As long as they each have a pathogenic variant in 1 copy of this gene, they're at risk to have a child who gets 2 pathogenic variants in the gene and actually has this recessive genetic condition, whatever it is. You can also see that this family might have kids who don't have the condition and are not carriers, or they might have kids who carry only mom's variant or only dad's variant. So de novo variants, or brand new mutations, are actually not that rare. What's unusual is when they happen in a gene that causes a disease so that we find out about them. So every time cells divide to make new cells, they copy all their genetic information, and they are really, really good at doing that, but not perfect. So there are often little mistakes that are made, little changes in the DNA that get copied on then to other cells that are made from the new cell further down the line. And when this happens in the production of germ cells, so sperm cells or egg cells, then that sperm or egg could go on to create a person who has a new variant that wasn't in the rest of the cells of either the mom or the dad. And we've all got a few of these variants that are new in us, that were not inherited from either parent, that just happened in the creation of the sperm cell or the egg cell that made us. And it only, as I said, becomes an issue when that variant is a change that causes disease. So it happens in a gene in an important spot, and it's a type of change that causes a problem. Some genetic conditions have very low rates of new mutations. So most people who have those conditions inherited it. It's traveled in their family. And some conditions have higher rates of new mutations. And that's just due to the difference between different genes. So some genes are really big and there's lots of genetic information where a change could potentially happen. Some genes are complicated or they have a structure that makes them more likely, more prone to new variants. So we know that some connective tissue conditions, for example, have a relatively high rate of de novo variants. And so there are often people who are the first person in their family to be affected with the condition. Usually de novo variants cause a dominant condition, as you can imagine, because it only takes one new genetic change to give somebody a dominant condition. We don't usually see de novo variants as a big major cause of recessive conditions because you have to get a variant from each parent or in each copy of the gene for a recessive condition. Once a person has a pathogenic variant for a dominant condition, it can be passed on to their children just like for anyone else who has a dominant genetic condition. So that 50-50 chance of passing on the copy of the gene with the variant or the copy of the gene that doesn't have that pathogenic variant. So this is just sort of a summary slide of what all the things that I just talked about inheritance. One copy of each gene from mom and one from dad. Dominant conditions require one pathogenic variant and one copy of gene. Recessive conditions are caused by having two pathogenic variants, so both copies of the gene are affected. And de novo variants can cause a new condition, usually a dominant condition, in a person who doesn't have any family history or anybody else in the family who has that variant before them. All right, so more specifically, let's think about genetics of the different types of EDS. This is a list of many of the types of EDS that have been described. I know it's not complete. There are new types that keep getting added to the list all the time. But this gives you an idea that many types of EDS are inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern. Those are the ones that say AD in parentheses, and I've colored them sort of this reddish color. And then many other types of EDS are inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern. So they say AR in parentheses, and they're kind of grayish black. You might notice that myopathic EDS has actually been reported to have dominant inheritance in some families and recessive inheritance in other families, and we don't have a complete explanation for how that works yet. You may also notice that I've listed hypermobile EDS and hypermobility spectrum disorder, or HSD, on this list as having autosomal dominant inheritance, even though nobody has discovered yet the genes associated with these conditions. The reason we can know what the inheritance pattern is because we've looked at large families that have hypermobile EDS, and we see that it can be passed from generation to generation. And we see that in a lot of families, it looks like it's about 50% of people tend to have the condition in the next generation, and about 50% of people don't have the condition. So it's a very clear pattern that looks like autosomal dominant inheritance. And so we assume that when we do discover genes, that's what it's going to look like. For the types of EDS that we do have genes, these are what they are. You'll notice that some types of EDS have more than one gene associated with them. That does not mean you need pathogenic variants in more than one gene to have that type. But for example, in classical EDS, if you have a pathogenic variant in either COL5A1 or COL5A2, that can give you classical EDS. So it's just there are two different genes that can both cause the same condition if they have a pathogenic variant in them. Things to remember about the genetics of EDS. Even in the same family with the same genetic variant, people can look like very different versions of the same condition. So some people have really mild symptoms, some people can have much more severe presentation. And so there's all kinds of other things that impact the severity of the disease and what that presentation looks like and what happens at what age and all kinds of things like that. So just because we know that somebody has the same genetic variant as someone else in their family, it doesn't necessarily mean that their condition is going to look the same. It just means they have the same genetic diagnosis. Also important to remember that the inheritance pattern of the type of EDS that is in your family determines the chance that you would have a child who also has that type of EDS. So we've talked kind of about the dominant inheritance and how it's that 50-50 chance for that one pathogenic variant to be passed on or not. For somebody who has a recessive type of EDS, like if you remember this pattern, this person who's shaded in, the last daughter in the row here in the family, has EDS. She has 2 pathogenic variants for whatever this recessive type of EDS is, but she only gets to pass on one or the other when she has children. So all of her kids are going to get one pathogenic variant in the gene that causes this condition, but the only way they will actually have the same type of EDS as their mom is if their other parent is also a carrier or also has that same type of EDS and has at least one pathogenic variant to pass on to them. So that's pretty unusual. Most people who have a recessive type of EDS are the only person in their family, or they and a sibling or a couple of siblings have it, but the next generation very, very rarely will have that same type of EDS because it's just really unusual for them to end up meeting and having kids with somebody else who also has a pathogenic variant in that same gene. And finally, it's really important to remember that each type of EDS is a different genetic condition. So they all get lumped together in the EDS umbrella because they have some similarities. But having one type of EDS does not increase your risk to have a child with a different type of EDS. So people ask this more frequently than I would have thought. So if you have hypermobile EDS, it's not going to change into something else when you have kids. You can't pass on something that you don't have yourself. So the only risk to your children for a different type of EDS would be if they had a de novo variant happen in them, which again would be quite unusual. All right. So when we think about genetic diagnosis and genetic testing, what does that actually entail? Remember, this is our diagram of a gene. You can see there's a sequence of genetic bases. And so when we do genetic testing, what we're doing is looking at that sequence. And we compare the sequence of that gene in the person who's being tested with a reference sequence to see if it looks the same. Do they have all the same DNA bases in the same order? And so one type of technology is called gene sequencing, or sometimes it's called next generation sequencing. That's the sort of the current best technology to use for genetic testing for the kinds of changes that cause EDS. And you can see here there's a sequence change. So this person's gene has one letter that's different from the reference sequence. So that's a genetic variant. We also, when we do genetic testing, we'll look for deletions or duplications in the DNA. So is there a larger chunk of DNA that's missing or extra in that person that disrupts the function of that gene? There are other types of genetic test technologies. One that has become really huge recently is genotyping, which is what the technology that's used for most consumer ordered genetic tests. So if you order ancestry testing or 23andMe or those kinds of tests, what they are doing is genotyping. And that means they're looking at specific pre-selected spots in genes to see if you have the same genetic base there, the same DNA base as the reference or not. They're not looking at the whole sequence of genes. They're not looking for deletions and duplications. So it's a different technology, and it's answering a very small and specific question. Do you have this DNA base at this spot? Do you have this DNA base at this spot? So some problems with this: the accuracy for these consumer ordered tests is less certain. There have been some studies that look at false positives and false negatives and frequency of failed reads on those tests. And it's definitely more of a problem than it is with next generation sequencing or the clinical types of tests that are done. For a lot of these genotyping tests, the health risks they're identifying are very small changes. So maybe you have a 0.1% increase in risk for diabetes. Maybe that's useful to you to know, but it's different from sort of the clinical genetic evaluation that we're doing, where we're looking for huge increases in risk or changes in healthcare management. And then the other thing I will caution people is that there are third-party interpretation services available for people to take their raw data from these genetic tests and upload it to a website that will reinterpret that raw data. These are totally unregulated services. I have seen a bunch of examples of complete misinformation, just like absolutely flat out wrong. There's not a lot of good science in some of these services. So I just warn people, be really cautious with genetic information that you get from the internet and not from a healthcare provider, because you don't know where that information is coming from or how accurate it can be. So if you do choose to have genetic testing, my best tips are to get help from someone who has some experience with genetic testing. Usually that would be a healthcare provider, somebody who has dealt with genetic testing before. They should talk with you about cost and insurance coverage if you're going to try and go through insurance. If they're not talking with you about that, ask. It might be a flag that they don't have as much experience with genetic testing, because insurance can be very sticky about covering genetic testing. It's a huge problem we face in our clinic, and we work very hard to figure out up front if people are going to have high costs for genetic tests. So that is doable if you work with somebody who knows how to figure that out. And then be sure that you're getting a lab that offers clinical genetic testing rather than genotyping. All right. So when I'm ordering genetic testing for a patient to try and answer a clinical question, I talk about 3 possible types of test results that can come back. So they might have a positive genetic test result, meaning we found a pathogenic genetic variant in one of the genes we were looking at, and they have a genetic diagnosis, and we kind of move forward down that path and make recommendations for them. When there's a pathogenic genetic variant identified, then other people in the family could be tested for it if they wanted to find out if they have the same genetic condition. Some patients get a negative genetic test result. So we've essentially ruled out a genetic condition, or we haven't found a genetic explanation for the symptoms that they're having. And laboratories will not report common variants or very clearly benign variants. So that would come back as a negative test, because there's lots of genetic variation between people that we know is normal and that we've seen before a lot of times. And so we know it doesn't cause health problems. The third possible type of genetic test result is a variant of uncertain significance. What this means is that the laboratory found a genetic variant. There's something that's different and that's unusual enough that they can't just write it off and say, oh, we've seen this before a million times, it's benign. But they don't have enough evidence to say that it actually causes any kind of a problem. So it's kind of a gray area in the middle between pathogenic and benign, where we aren't quite sure with the evidence that we have. People get sometimes very anxious when they have a variant of uncertain significance. And so I try to tell patients up front that this is a possible test result, and that these are actually very common. There's a lot of genetic variation between people, and a lot of it is rare, and so it hasn't been seen before enough by laboratories to be able to classify it. It's not something the patient needs to worry about and constantly check in on. The laboratory will keep trying to get more data. Laboratories are very often reclassifying genetic test results. They reclassify variants when they get more information that tells them whether it's pathogenic or benign. And they will automatically send a new report if that reclassification happens to the provider who ordered your test. So you can always check back in with that provider, but they should get an automatic reissue of the report if there is something that changes about the classification of the VUS. And so then your provider would presumably get in touch with you and let you know. The other thing that I try to emphasize to patients is that most VUSs turn out to be benign if we're able to get enough information to reclassify them. So when we look at historical data, most of these are just rare benign variants that are different between people. And so we don't change people's healthcare based on a variant of uncertain significance. That's really important. Does not mean you have a genetic diagnosis. Even if it's in a gene that you were suspicious of and included in your test in the first place, it could very likely still just be a benign genetic variant. So we really don't like to manage people's healthcare based on these VUSs. So if you get a genetic test result and it's pathogenic and you have a genetic diagnosis for a condition, what do people do with this information? So for some people, the value of this is just that it confirms or rules out a diagnosis if they have a negative test for something where we're really good at testing for that condition. For some people, they use this information for reproductive planning. And I'll talk about some of those prenatal testing options that people might use it for. Sometimes it's useful just to be able to test other family members who haven't had any symptoms up until now, but might be worried that they still have this same genetic diagnosis and could develop symptoms in the future. And then sometimes people use this information to participate in research or in clinical trials where there's a genetic diagnosis required to be able to enroll. So there are lots of different ways that genetic test results can be helpful. All right. Prenatal genetic testing options. What can we do and when? So this is my pregnancy timeline, first trimester, second and third. There are different options depending on when in the pregnancy people are interested in doing testing. So I'll talk about PGD, which can be done before a pregnancy is established. I'll talk about CVS. I'll talk about amniocentesis in the second trimester. And then we already kind of talked about regular genetic testing for people in the general population. And for some people, they'll just wait until a child is born and then deal with it at that point. So PGD stands for Preimplantation Genetic Diagnosis. Some labs also call it PGTM. I'm not sure why it was necessary to do a name change, but those are the same thing. And this is essentially doing in vitro fertilization. So taking sperm and eggs taken from the two people and creating embryos in a lab, and then growing those embryos in the incubator until they're big enough that they can take a few cells, they can biopsy the embryo and do genetic testing on those few cells to see if the embryo carries the known genetic variant in the family. And then if they have an embryo that has grown well and doesn't have the variant and looks like it might establish a pregnancy, they can transfer that back into whoever's going to carry the pregnancy to try and get them pregnant. So this is a super cutting edge, cool technology. You can see here, this is a picture of an embryo biopsy. So the small tube on the right is actually sucking a few cells off of the edge of the embryo. Those cells around the edge are the ones that would go on to become the placenta, and there's plenty more of them left. So this is, you're not taking anything away from the ability to form a placenta. The biopsy stays way away from the inner cell mass that will go on to become the fetus. We don't think it would do any harm to take cells from that inner cell mass, but it's just not done to be absolutely as safe as possible. The downsides of PGD are that it's very expensive. Most people can't afford to do it, and insurance rarely provides coverage. Some plans do provide some coverage for IVF, but often it's in the context of infertility. So you have to have proven infertility to get coverage for IVF. And many plans won't cover embryo testing, which is a few $1,000s more on top of the IVF cycle cost. Some people will end up without any embryos to transfer even after going through an IVF cycle. So people have to do multiple cycles if they can afford it and have trouble actually getting an embryo they can use. And some couples will have enough success that they have multiple embryos, maybe even more than they wanted to have. And then we'll have to make decisions about what they want to do with those embryos when they're done having kids. So a lot of things to think through, a lot of considerations that can be very difficult for people. And I highly recommend, if this is something you're interested in doing, that you talk with somebody way ahead of time, get as much information as possible, have these important conversations. So the next time point when genetic testing is possible in pregnancy is in the first trimester, about 11 weeks, when you can do something called chorionic villus sampling. Chorionic villi are little finger-shaped things that stick out from the placenta. So again, this is a sample of cells from the placenta, not from the fetus. And this is a technology that was developed to screen for missing or extra chromosomes that cause conditions such as Down syndrome. But now the technology is available to actually be able to take that same sample of the cells from the placenta and look for a genetic variant that's known in the family to see if the fetus is affected. So here's a diagram of chorionic villus sampling, or CVS. You can see there's an ultrasound probe on the belly, just like any normal prenatal ultrasound, so they can see where the placenta is, where the fetus is. They can see the fluid around the fetus, and there's a catheter here going in vaginally because that's the easiest access with the placenta where it is. CVS can also be done with a needle through the abdomen, depending on the placement of the placenta. They'll choose whichever route is considered to be safest for the pregnancy. There is a tiny risk of miscarriage from this procedure. So it's something that people think carefully about whether they want to do it. It's not without a little bit of risk. The next time period when people can do genetic testing is in the second trimester, about 16 to 20 weeks of pregnancy, and they can do something called amniocentesis or amnio. And this is just taking a sample of the amniotic fluid that the fetus is floating in, which has lots and lots of cells that have sloughed off from the fetus's skin and the inside of their mouth, and they swallow it and they pee it out. So there's lots and lots of fetal cells in that fluid. And this again was a test developed to screen for chromosome abnormalities. And they also can do some testing of that fluid to look for risk of open neural tube defects like spina bifida. But now we have the technology to be able to use the amnio to do genetic testing as well if there's a known genetic condition in the family that the parents want the fetus to be tested for. So this is a diagram of the amnio. It's a very similar process. They use the ultrasound again to make sure they know where all the structures are, placenta, fetus. They look for a nice big pocket of fluid so they can get a very safe sample. And again, there's a very small risk of miscarriage, a little bit smaller risk than there is for CVS, but not very high in either case. All right. So the one other thing that I will mention is a technology called cell-free DNA, or sometimes it's called non-invasive prenatal testing, NIPT. And this is a test that's offered to many couples now in pregnancy. It's basically a blood test for mom that's looking for little fragments of fetal DNA that are floating around in mom's blood. This technology is not ready to be used yet for testing for a single gene disorder. So you could not use this to test for any type of EDS. At this point, it's really only sort of validated and proven to be a good test for screening for missing or extra chromosomes. And it's still not 100% for that. So if you have an abnormal cell-free DNA screen, your provider will offer you the option to confirm using either CVS or amnio, depending on when in the pregnancy it is. I just mentioned this here because it is something that a lot of couples will be offered, and I want to be clear that this is not a way to do prenatal testing for a single gene disorder yet. It is definitely something that people are working on and may be coming in the future. All right, other things that I like to tell patients. Some people don't do any of these testing options. There is no requirement that just because you have a known genetic diagnosis that you have to test a pregnancy or a child for that genetic condition. So lots of families say, you know what, I'm not gonna do anything differently. I'm gonna go ahead and have my kid and I don't wanna know this information during the pregnancy. The other thing to remember is that, as we talked about before, having the same genetic variant as someone else in the family does not mean the condition is going to look the same in both people. So even if a pregnancy, test determines that the child or the fetus is affected, it doesn't tell us what's going to happen for them, how severe or how mild the condition will be for them. There are a lot of ways to become a parent. And so I've worked with patients who have chosen all of the things listed here, using donor sperm or egg, using a surrogate to carry, a child, adopting, fostering. There are all kinds of options. The other thing that I think is important to think about if you have EDS and are thinking about becoming pregnant is to talk about your plan with your healthcare providers so that they can help you think through what that will mean for your body, regardless of risks to children. You want to make sure that they know about your diagnosis. You want to make sure that you talk about any medications you're taking, including supplements that you're taking that are just bought over the counter. Some of those are not necessarily safe in pregnancy. So you want to have somebody look at your whole list of everything that you're taking and figure out if there are any changes that need to be made before you become pregnant. And then finally, just keep in mind that pregnancy is hard work for everybody. Everyone has more joint pain, more problems with hypermobility of their joints when they're pregnant than they do otherwise. And so think ahead about how you can take best care of yourself, knowing what your issues are and what things you have the most trouble with. Try to get ahead of those issues because pregnancy is it's a big undertaking. All right. So I will finish with some considerations for anybody who is thinking about having children, things that we would talk about as genetic counselors with all couples. Carrier screening is offered for a large number of recessive genetic conditions. So remember the ones where you could be carrying a genetic variant, but you wouldn't have the condition yourself, and you might just have a risk for children to have it if your partner also is a carrier for the same condition. Carrier screening can also look at some X-linked conditions, things that are more sex-specific that might affect kids of one gender more severely than others. And I put some carrier frequencies here so you can see that it's not rare to be a carrier of something. Most people are a carrier for some recessive condition. It's actually quite common to be a carrier for something, and the only issue is if your partner is a carrier for the same genetic condition. So if you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis and they're a carrier for spinal muscular atrophy, your kids are not at high risk, right? They might be carriers for either of those things, but they're not at high risk to actually have those conditions if you're carriers for different genetic conditions. There's also a chance in any pregnancy for some sort of a developmental abnormality. So heart defects are very common. Chromosome conditions like Down syndrome are not rare. So all of these things can happen in any pregnancy. We don't really understand all of the risk factors. We know some of them. For example, we know that moms who are older age when they have a child are more likely to have a child with Down syndrome. But young moms also can have a child with Down syndrome. So we really don't have a way to prevent or predict any of these things from happening for anybody. These are some of the resources I would recommend as places that have reliable information about genetics and about pregnancy. So if you're looking for a genetic counselor, some of these websites have search tools to find somebody in your area. And they also all have some really good information available just online if you want to kind of click around and read more. All right, so I will finish there with some happy baby pictures. And I'm happy to take questions about any of the topics we've touched on.
Alrighty, thank you again so much for joining us. That was a fantastic webinar. It was a fantastic presentation at the conference and was one of the most asked for. We have some questions in, but just a reminder, you can still type questions in at any time that you have for Lauren in the question box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. The first question we have is, how can we get genetic testing requests to be completed in the UK through the NHS?
That is not my area of expertise. I do not know the answer to that. I do know that there are some genetic counselors who are members of the National Society of Genetic Counselors here who practice in the UK, and I imagine there's also a professional organization of genetic counselors in the UK. So I would just start with a web search and look for groups of genetic counselors because they will have a good way to contact people.
Thank you so much. Another option is we have our helpline that you can either call into or email into, and we will be able to help you try to find a genetic counselor or a medical professional that you need as best as we can.
Yeah, that's an even better option because the EDS Society is everywhere.
We try, we try. And if not, we have staff members that are from the UK that are also doctors that work with health professionals that might be able to get answers. So if that was your question, drop me a comment, drop me an email, and we will get you your answer. Our next question is, which healthcare providers can support an EDSer looking to start a family, and how can we access them?
Sure. So I would say to start with a primary care physician and ask those questions. If you have a good primary care provider that you feel comfortable with, they will be able to refer you to talk with an obstetrician or a genetic counselor. If you are thinking you might want to talk about fertility treatments like doing IVF and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, you'd want to talk with a specialized fertility clinic. But if you have a primary care provider, they're going to know what's in your area and how you can get access to them. If you don't have a good primary care provider, I would start by finding one.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Our next question is, I have vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. What are the chances of hemorrhaging during pregnancy?
So, that's a good question. We have a lot of patients that we see here who have vascular EDS because the physician that I work with, Peter Byers, has a particular interest. And there's not going to be a good number for you because there's no sort of general number that applies to everybody. Typically, the risks are highest at the very end of pregnancy. So delivery is a risky time when you definitely want to have somebody who specializes in high-risk pregnancy management. But it makes sense to work with somebody all along who specializes in high-risk pregnancy management because you're increasing the blood flow to all parts of your body. You just want somebody to really be keeping a very close eye on your blood pressure and any symptoms you're having that might be at all out of the ordinary. So I don't have a great answer for a risk number, but it's definitely a riskier proposition than it is for people who don't have vascular EDS to be pregnant. But lots of women have bleeding issues even if they don't have a vascular EDS diagnosis. So if you're taken care of in a really good high-risk center, they will most likely recommend a C-section. That's kind of the expert opinion right now, so that you're not laboring and putting your body through all of that intense pressure and high stress. I would say, yeah, I don't have a great number for you, but for sure talk with somebody who deals with high-risk pregnancy. And the helpline is a great resource if you want to get hooked up with an obstetrician who specializes, who's worked with patients with vascular EDS, because there are a few throughout the country who are excellent.
We also have a few videos on our YouTube page by Dr. Natalie Blagowodow, I hope I said her name correctly, that talks about pregnancy and EDS and delivery as well. So there's more options there as well. Our next question is, can it be safe to carry full term? I'm worried about pelvic dislocations.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an obstetrician. I'm not a high-risk pregnancy manager. Some people have tremendous problems in pregnancy, like everything gets thrown out of whack. And some people sail through it, even though, they have all kinds of joint issues, before and after pregnancy. So I do not have a great answer. That's definitely a question to talk with your own providers about, who know you and know your history. But I don't think we have a good way to predict who's going to have the most trouble with pregnancy. There's so much we don't understand.
All right, thank you so much. Next question. Would having hypermobile EDS result in having what would be considered a high-risk pregnancy?
So most women with hypermobile EDS do fine with pregnancy. They may deliver a little bit more quickly. Labor may be a little shorter because the tissues are stretchy. And so that's, sort of the problem of delivery is getting everything stretched out so the baby can come out. So we, wouldn't recommend that you go, someplace that's 6 hours away from the nearest medical care when you're getting close to delivery. But otherwise, people typically tend to do well if they plan for the things that are their issues. So if you tend to have hip problems, you want to sort of plan ahead and think about how you're going to support yourself best to deal with those things in pregnancy when there's just a little bit more strain everywhere.
All right. Does the risk of issues and miscarriage increase with vascular Ehlers-Danlos if performing CVS or amniocentesis?
That is an excellent question, and I don't think anybody has looked at it. I don't think anybody has done a real study.
So to go with what you said about the other things, just be prepared, have people on hand that are knowledgeable would be.
Yeah, for sure. You want to make sure that for anybody who's thinking about doing a CVS or an amniocentesis, you want to ask your provider how many of them they do a year. If they do 2 procedures a year, then maybe you want to ask for somebody who does more, who's more experienced with those procedures. Because in the right hands, in very experienced hands, the risk is really minimal.
We have a clarification. Is it true that EDS hypermobility type has less effect on, this is a different question. One of the questions that came in that I directed to the helpline, but might be interesting to talk about, is it true that EDS hypermobility type has less effect on boys than it has on girls? And therefore, would it be better to get boys than girls because they would be less affected by EDS?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So in the general population, when we look at men and women tend to be more mobile. They have more mobile joints than men who are similar age, similar fitness level, all that kind of stuff, right? So something about being female makes us bendier. And so it makes sense that boys who have hypermobile EDS have some sort of protective factor that might make their joint pain or joint issues a little bit less severe. We really don't know what those factors are. We don't know if it's hormonal or structural because of some of the differences in how men and women's bodies are put together. But yeah, it is certainly possible that boys would be a little bit less affected, but for any individual person, we don't know. There's some very bendy boys and some very inflexible girls. So it would be hard to predict just based on gender whether that child would have more severe or less severe problems. That's a great question.
Thank you so much. My husband and I are looking to start a family. I'm looking to get a diagnosis to confirm what type of EDS I have. Are most genetic counselors familiar with EDS, or should I try to find one that is familiar?
So most genetic counselors will have heard of EDS. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's something everybody sees in their practice. So it would be worth trying to find someplace that has some population of patients with connective tissue issues. I will tell you that it can also be hard to find a clinic that will see you if you have sort of vague connective tissue symptoms. So if all you have is joint hypermobility, a lot of genetics clinics will say, we don't have any tests to offer you because nobody knows the gene for hypermobile EDS. So sometimes it can be hard to find a provider who will see you if those are the kinds of symptoms that you're looking for a clear diagnosis for. There are some great rheumatologists and even some primary care doctors that are comfortable diagnosing hypermobile EDS. So those can be other options. There are published criteria, clinical criteria that can be helpful. So yeah, I would say if you can find somebody who knows about EDS, that's worth doing. But if you have trouble with that, just finding somebody who's willing to really look at those criteria and kind of take you through them and see what they can figure out.
All right, thank you so much. We have another question. There are many comorbidities that come with EDS, POTS being one of the big ones. Is there any research or is there any way to know if that can be passed on to a child, or is that another, I guess, crapshoot, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, so POTS is one of the things that people can have trouble with, particularly with hypermobile EDS. And POTS is just sort of a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. So things aren't regulated quite as tightly as you'd like them to be, to sort of keep your blood pressure constant so that you don't feel dizzy every time you stand up and your heart doesn't kind of, give you palpitations, things like that. I think, we think that hypermobile EDS is probably this autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. So passing on a genetic variant that, gives your child that condition is that 50-50 chance. But whether they would have POTS as part of it, we really don't know. So sometimes in a family we see, a number of people that we think, oh, these people have hypermobile EDS. They have enough features that they meet criteria and they have it. But some of them have autonomic problems like POTS and some of them don't. Some of them just have joint issues as their primary issues. So certainly POTS is something that can go along with, hypermobile EDS being passed down in families, but not everybody necessarily develops it.
Alrighty, I believe that is all the questions we have for today. If anybody has any last minute questions, now is the time to get them in. If not, we're gonna wrap it up. Well, I think we're done with the question part. So thank you again for coming out and doing this webinar for us. If anybody would like any more information about anything that was presented today, please check out our website for more resources or information. Feel free to give our helpline a call or an email, and definitely consider signing up for our newsletter if you haven't already. It's a fantastic resource for the most up-to-date information and upcoming events. Technology permitting, this webinar should be available on our YouTube channel once it makes it through our post-production. If you found this webinar helpful in any way, please consider hitting that like button once the webinar is available, and subscribe to our channel so that you can be alerted to when we're uploading videos. Once again, thank you so much, Lauren. As usual, an amazing presentation, easy to understand, helpful with Q&A. I hope you and everybody that joined us today has a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Farewell, everyone.